Okay, David, we've known each other a long time. We always get together under good times and have fun. I'm sorry, this is a terrible week for you. How are you doing? You must know people and family and that have been affected by this.
I know primarily people, first of all, I know people who sent me pictures of themselves and their families in bomb shelters. And I know people whose children were called up and will probably be going into Gaza. And that is a terrifying, terrifying prospect. And then, of course, I know people who are bereaved. I am fortunate enough not to have lost anybody that is close to me thus far. But it's one of the things that you hear from every Israeli is Israel is a very small country. I mean, geographically, it's smaller than New Jersey. All of its citizens together are probably 8 or 9 million, which is much smaller, for example, than the city of Los Angeles. And so nobody is unaffected by an event like this. When 1,000 people die in a population of 8 or 9 million, that's equivalent to a much, much, much larger number in a larger country.
Yeah, and I guess we don't really know what the true number is. Over 1,000, could be several thousand. Right. So give us your first impressions. I mean, were you surprised as everybody else?
My impressions were like between shock and horror and heartbreak. Those were the three major emotions. The first shock was like everybody in the world, and I know that I'm just reiterating what every single commentator has said. I could not believe that Israel was as direly unprepared for this as they obviously were. We can talk about why that is, but the why is less important than the fact that it's true. The horror was the just savage, gleeful brutality of the assault and beheadings and rape and mutilation and the display of people and on and on. And then the heartbreak for the enormous amount of pain that had already been experienced, and also even now the pain that we know will be experienced in the future from innocents on both sides of this conflict.
Yeah. Well, I suspect the kind of post-mortem on the intelligence agencies and military apparatus and so forth will be ongoing for a long time. But maybe it's just the same thing with 9/11 here. We just, everybody seemed to be surprised. After the fact, you can kind of back in and go, well, this agency should have been talking to that agency, and this kind of intelligence should have been channeled over here rather than there. We should have noticed that these pilots were taking training on flying planes, but not landing them or taking off.
Right.
So, but that's the hindsight bias. After the fact, you know what you should have looked for. You know what you didn't know. But if we knew, of course, it wouldn't have happened. And it could be that, the world is mostly random and chaotic, and people themselves don't know what they're going to do. And so, although this was clearly planned, it may not have been as obvious to anybody. It's like the fall of the Soviet Union. How did the world's leading experts on Sovietology not see that coming? Well, maybe the Soviets themselves really didn't understand how it was all going to play out, and that's the way the world works.
Well, one of the things that you and I share, among many, is we both believe in randomness and unpredictability. And it's absolutely true that when you look at a pattern of things in retrospect, it's very hard to retroject and figure out how in advance people didn't know that this could happen. This one, in some ways, I think is harder even to understand than 9/11, because 9/11 was an unprecedented event. Although this was unprecedented from Hamas, you know that you have a surreptitiously funded, brutal enemy on your border. And in fact, Israel had all sorts of security apparatus to monitor Hamas, electronic things, other things, through the tunnels. And so I think it requires even more extensive self-examination than 9/11. But at this point, as I said, that's not what's at the top of the agenda.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so maybe a PSA explainer for us, you mentioned Israel's about the size of New Jersey, 8 to 9 million people, and so let me be the stand-in to ask the dumb questions that I'm sure many people have. What's the difference between Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and Hamas and Hezbollah, and which one is which, and Shia and Sunni, and you just get it all confused. Kind of walk us through it.
It's easy to get confused. One of the things that America, let me start with this. Let me tell you what makes America different from Israel. I once had a bunch of students from NYU Abu Dhabi. It's the first time they were ever in a synagogue. And I asked them what makes America successful. And they gave me all the standard answers, the Constitution, and I said, look, these are all good answers. I said, but let me give you my answer. Mexico, Canada, ocean, ocean. We don't realize in America how, having two countries on our border that, yes, we've had wars with, but are essentially not threatening to us, and certainly not threatening to us now, and two oceans on our border gives us a sense of security that almost no other country can have. We don't have any hostile powers on our border. Israel has only hostile powers on their border. Now, one of them, they made peace with, Jordan. Jordan is on the West Bank, and I'll explain the West Bank in a minute. The other one they made peace with on the southern border is Egypt. For a long time, Egypt and Jordan were just about the most dangerous enemies that Israel had. To make peace with Egypt, Israel gave back the Sinai desert, which also had a lot of very, very wealthy and important spots to it, resource rich, but it was more than worth it, certainly, to make peace. When they made peace with Jordan in 1967, Jordan did not want the West Bank back. And Israel, nonetheless, I think probably maybe should have given it back. That could have been a crucial mistake. But the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, relatively speaking to Hamas, is a somewhat stable, mostly non-terroristic group. There are terror elements in it. It was born of terror. It was Yasser Arafat's organization. The problem is it's also not terribly democratic. Mahmoud Abbas has been the leader for quite a long time, and he's in his 80s. And one of the reasons that they don't have an election is because I think they're afraid that a more radical group will be elected on the West Bank. On the other side of Israel is Gaza. So there are populations of Palestinians on either side of Israel, as well as in Israel itself. There are about 2 million Israeli Arabs. And it's important to say Israeli Arabs enjoy full civil rights inside Israel, those who live inside Israel, so much so that one of the characteristics that people are always unaware of is that an Israeli president was put in jail by a female Arab Supreme Court justice, something that would not happen in a place where Arabs had no civil rights. Nonetheless, Gaza, in 2005, Ariel Sharon, who was a very hawkish prime minister, which was why he could do this, withdrew all Israelis from Gaza. It became essentially Judenrein. No Jews lived in Gaza, and thousands of Jews were forcibly removed from their homes. So in the hope that Gaza would become a democratic and peaceful place. That obviously has not happened. In fact, although people talk about Gaza being occupied, it's not occupied. Israel, it is true, does not allow an international airport in Gaza for obvious reasons. And there is a monitoring of what goes in and out of Gaza, also for obvious reasons. But as we saw, the monitoring isn't careful enough because periodically Israel would go in and try to bomb military installations. But Gaza also, even though the Hamas are Sunni, are supported by the Iranian regime, which is Shia, and that's in the north. In the north, Iran supplies Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon. Some of your listeners may remember there was a Lebanese war. That's the third enemy on the border. And right now, there is tremendous fear in Israel that a northern front, that is Hezbollah, is going to open up, because we know that Hezbollah has at least 150,000 rockets that it could launch into Israel. And so you have Hamas on one side, Hezbollah in the north, and nothing brings people together like a common enemy. They don't love each other, but they hate Israel more. And Hamas, I just want to say, in Gaza, has in its charter a call for the destruction of Israel, and also, quoting one of the hadiths of the Quran, also a call to kill Jews. So we know that, unfortunately, when you combine all these enemies, we're not only talking about a desire to have these people did not come over the Gaza fence saying two-state solution. The idea was to kill as many Jews as possible, and that is an idea that has found its way sometimes into Paris and London and Pittsburgh and Orange County. So that's a quick précis of the situation. Like all people's problems that are not your own, it's hard to keep straight unless you pay attention to it a great deal.
Yeah, well, that was a good explainer. Gaza itself is what, 6 miles across and 25 miles long.
Yeah.
Something like 2 million people. How many Hamas people are there that are really terrorists?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that, because it depends how you define a Hamas person. I mean, do you find them as a fighter, as a sympathizer? We don't exactly know. What we do know is that Gaza is very dense. It's built a lot of buildings together, and that Hamas very deliberately, and this is not our invention, I mean, the leaders of Hamas have said so much, place military installations in other institutions to protect them, or if they're bombed, to give them PR points in hospitals, in kindergartens, in places where if they are destroyed, then you can say, look at what the terrible Israelis did. And if they are not destroyed, then the military installations stay intact. So it is an extremely difficult undertaking, but you can see that the two populations treat their civilians in exactly opposite ways.
Yeah, here's the headline of Wall Street Journal Tuesday showing these tanks and missiles as the Israel readies ground assault in Gaza. I mean, that's some serious weaponry, and there's probably 100,000 of those.
Right.
How do you root out the truly evil people from just innocent citizens living there who don't want anything to do with this? They're just trying to live their lives, and yet they can't rise up and overthrow or put in check the Hamas terrorists. It just seems impossible.
No, you encourage them, which Netanyahu did. You encourage them to flee, and Egypt says, our borders are open. But of course, I hate to say this. I mean, it sounds, but Hamas doesn't want them to flee. That's not what they want. And so it's going to, you will see in the weeks ahead, and I mean, everybody knows this is coming. There are going to be calls about proportionality and restraint. The difficulty here is as when America defeated Germany or Japan. I mean, the casualties were tremendously lopsided. Many, many, many more Germans died and Japanese died than Americans did. But America felt at the time that was the only actual way to end the war. And the question is, could you actually end? I mean, we've tried before numerous times, and this is what we got. Can you end the war with Hamas without extensive civilian casualties? And the tragic answer to that may be no.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't know what the solution is. It just seems hopeless. Again, these kind of mass bombings of German cities. I mean, what was that supposed to accomplish? It's not like the citizens themselves are going to say, all right, here, Hitler, we've had it. You're out. They can't do anything.
No. No, the only strategy, I don't know about the mass bombings of German cities, the only possible benefit of that strategy is for the citizens to say, Hamas costs us too much. We can't stand doing this anymore, and we have to find another way to prosecute our aims other than through Hamas.
Right. All right. Let's talk about U.S. Intervention over the last few years, the Abraham Accords, U.S. foreign policy with Israel over the long haul, and now, say, the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Some right-wing talking points the last few days have been not so much this is Biden's fault directly, but, that he ennobled Iran to then give support to Hamas and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
So I try as hard as I can to stay away from the political side. I have no particular expertise. I'm a rabbi. Um, Seriously. I mean, I thought at the time that the Iran deal was a mistake, but I thought that as a private citizen, not as a political pundit. And I understand the impulse to want to try to create some kind of rapprochement with Iran because Iran is not just a troublemaker in the region, but potentially such a tremendous threat in the region. And we see that there are, I mean, the Iranian public, the actual Iranian on the street, is very sympathetic to Israel and to the United States. I don't think there's anywhere that we know of where there is such an obvious divide between the population and the government. The question is, how do you bring down the government? And there have been attempts to do so, so far unsuccessful, as we know. And so at a certain point, the entire effort of first the Obama administration and then the Biden administration was to try to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. So here are the arguments, and I will let your listeners, as I said, I read a lot about this stuff, but it is not my expertise. So the argument of the Obama administration was, yes, this is not a perfect deal, but you don't get a perfect deal in this world. Your enemies don't generally conform to what you want them to do. And at least this guarantees for 10 years, they will not have a nuclear bomb. The Trump administration said this is a terrible deal and we're reneging on it. The argument for that is if it's a terrible deal, you renege on it. The argument against that was twofold. One was nobody's going to make a deal with America anymore. If what happens is every time the other administration comes in, they say, we don't like this, forget it. And two is that now Iran has absolutely no motivation not to accelerate their nuclear program. And according to most Israelis that I spoke to, during the Trump administration, they accelerated it much faster than during the Obama administration. Now you get the Biden administration coming back and trying the strategy of the Obama administration. But of course, in between, there's been another shift. So the Iranians are less willing to make a deal, probably made a worse deal, or tried to. They actually never fully reached a deal. And Biden, in an attempt to get a deal, released funds that the Iranians had frozen. They were Iranian money, not American taxpayer money, which some people are saying, but still it was $6 billion, still a lot of money. And the question is, what will that money do? Now, it wasn't released in time to finance this operation. Nobody thinks that this came as a result of the money that was released, but it's clear from this operation that, as we all know, money is fungible, and you can say it's going for humanitarian aid, and that's very, very hard to monitor. So a part of me wants to say, which is not, again, I say this not as a political expert, and all of you out there who are, please hear my caveats. It doesn't work to deprive them, and it doesn't work to supply them. We have this bias sometimes in America that if we just hit on the right policy, things will go the way we want. I'm not sure that that's true here. Without an internal uprising, I think Iran will be and is the most dangerous country in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I just don't see how it happens. Practically speaking, in game theory, there's this thing called belling the cat. problem where, all the mice decide it would be good to put a bell on the cat so we know when it's coming. But who's going to do it? Because whoever tries to do it's going to get eaten, right? So you go first. I'm right behind you. Yeah. So who's going to rise up? And, we know in these totalitarian regimes, they just lock people up. There's no free press. How do you get it started? Same thing with Putin now. I mean, why don't they overthrow him? Well, who's going to do that? We see what happens to his enemies. He just kills them or imprisons them. So, yeah, it just seems impossible. And this whole business of going door to door. Yeah, I've seen the footage of Gaza. I mean, it's just packed. It's like downtown LA, just door to door to door. It would just take years. And then you end up with these mass casualties like, U.S. soldiers in Iraqi cities and Afghanistan cities where they literally go door to door, and you end up with, a body count much higher than 9/11 on our own side, not to mention their side. And it just seems hopeless.
And as many people have said, and I'm sure this is a fairly obvious point once you think about it. If Hamas has been planning this, as they say, for 2 years, imagine how much they have booby-trapped the cities of Gaza in the certain knowledge that Israel will retaliate. And so you're walking into a trap, knowingly, but you are walking into a trap, and yet they have 50, 60, 100 hostages. So I don't think that Israel has an alternative here that is good.
And just a mass bombing and turning Gaza into rubble would kill millions of innocent people, and we just can't do that.
Yeah. Well, no, that's the other thing is that, I don't want to get too, sometimes when I hear these points come out of my mouth, they almost sound glib, and I don't mean them to. But, people accuse Israel of being a genocidal regime. Well, if Israel wanted to commit genocide,
they could do it. Yeah.
It could do so, and it could do it very easily. In fact, the Palestinian population has grown every single year. And when people argue with me about the situation, I always ask them one question. If tomorrow the Palestinians had the firepower of the Israelis and the Israelis had the firepower of the Palestinians, how many Jews do you think would be left in Israel in a week? And my answer is very, very few.
Yeah.
And yet the Israelis have that firepower, but despite the cries of genocide, there has been no genocide, and no one in Israel wants genocide. But
all right, then just big picture. Why does the United States support Israel since the very beginning, politically, morally, religiously?
So I think that there are multiple reasons. Walter Russell Mead just wrote a very long but very good book about this, and he's been arguing for a long time that it's, which is true, that it's idiocy to say it's the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote doesn't, there are too few Jews in this country. And the Jewish vote, you'll notice, didn't do anything to get Roosevelt to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz. And if Jews are so powerful, it's amazing that the Holocaust happened just 80 years ago. But nonetheless, I think America supports Israel, first of all, because Israel is a culturally congenial democracy in the Middle East. When you go to Israel, you feel like, this is familiar to me in a way that is not true in many other countries of the world. It's a lot more, going to Tel Aviv is a lot more like going to Rio or London than it is like going to Riyadh. Second, I think that there is a deep religious affinity from a Christian nation to a Jewish nation. Judaism and Christianity have had a long and painful history, but they have a common root. And so, Jesus walked those streets. And so for a Christian, the feeling of Israel is different from almost any other country in the world. And then third, Israel has been an enormous strategic asset to the United States. We are its eyes and ears in the Middle East. And the Middle East is a crucial area for not only for oil, but also geostrategically. And so for all those reasons and more, what you discover is actually that among the Christian community in America, Israel scores extremely high on approval ratings. And in fact, one of the things that, as a rabbi, I used to berate my Jewish congregations for sometimes was during the Intifada, during the time that there were uprisings in Israel, Christian groups kept going and some Jewish groups canceled their trips. And we were saying, like, look at your Christian brothers and sisters who are going to Israel. Why aren't you going to Israel? So I think that I think it's multiple reasons, and that they're good ones.
I've been glad to see clarification in the last week or so that Israel has not had citizens in Gaza since 2005, I think you said.
Yep.
But clarify again on the West Bank. Weren't there stories about Israeli settlements pushing up into Palestinian land? And
So here you're going to get me in trouble. But look, there are settlements and there are settlements, right? There are settlements that everybody agrees. I mean, that one of the painful ironies, really painful ironies of this whole conflict is for a long time, everybody has basically known what the borders will be when it is settled. And Israel has, by the way, made this offer repeatedly. Mm-hmm. They made it under Barak. They made it with Rabin at Camp David. Olmert made the offer, and it's always been no. And the reason it's been no, I think, in part, is because of what happened to Sadat. That is, any Palestinian leader who says yes to Israel may not be long for this world. Having said that, so some of the settlements, what are called settlements, are in fact towns and cities that everybody knows are going to stay in Israel and then there are these three guys and a goat settlements, which make my blood boil, because really they are a combination of religious literalism, that is, everything here is ours because we're Jewish, which I think is foolish and counterproductive at best. Or they're a product of this kind of macho posturing of I get to be wherever I want to be. And the fact that I'm usurping what is yours and you can't do anything about it is just a display of my strength. So I think some of the settlements are disgraceful and illegal. And the Supreme Court has actually prevented a number of the settlements, but not as many as I think sometimes they should. So that's the settlement.
Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about some of the crazy responses we've heard this week. The day after Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, the Democratic Socialists of America held a protest in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to resist 75 years of occupation and apartheid. 34, now I think it's 37, Harvard student organizations, I didn't know they had that many, signed a joint statement excusing the murder and kidnapping of women and children. The apartheid regime is the only one to blame, the statement read. The coming days will require a firm stance against colonial retaliation. Let's see, Yale professor Zarina Graywall on X, after the attack, quote, prayers for Palestinians. Israel is a murderous, genocidal settler state, and Palestinians have every right to resist through armed struggle. Solidarity. Finally, last example, leaders of the Black Lives Matter wrote that it stands in solidarity with our Palestinian family and called on people to understand the resistance in Palestine as an attempt to tear down the gates of the world's largest open-air prison. What do you make of that American response to what's going on? It just seems unbelievable.
So, is it unbelievable?
Maybe not. Maybe I'm naive.
So first of all, I think the Democratic Socialists maybe want to change their name to the National Socialists, because the end result is not so different. I mean, because I'm at Harvard, I've been deeply involved in this fracas here. What happened was a bunch of student groups. By the way, I want to, in all fairness, some of the people who were members of these groups had no idea that the leadership of the group was putting out this statement and were horrified at it. And now and now they're suffering because their name is out there in corporate
Right.
America as someone who said these terrible things.
Yes.
So I just want to say that, and I'm not. I really, it's not my way to think that somebody should be punished forever for a stupid thing they say at age 20, however hateful the thing is. Really, we do too much of that in this country, and I'm sure you are as grateful as I am that not everything I said at 20 is on social media. The opportunity to outlive your mistakes is a really important one. So I would say that. But also, what happened was there was a reaction, and the president issued a statement. The new president of Harvard, who walked from her inauguration into this maelstrom, I put out, along with several other people, a separate statement that was signed now by over 350 professors. I put out. I didn't write it. I was part of the small committee. It was done primarily by a computer science professor named Boaz Barak, who deserves the credit for it. But again, there was a group in the Divinity School, which is where I am, of a couple of professors from the Center of Religion and Public Life who put out a similar statement to the one that the student groups put out. And then the dean had to write a letter saying again that this is unacceptable and that this isn't. So there is an internal struggle here. And I am sad to say, I say this descriptively and not that it is almost exclusively the far left, the progressive left, that is with by the way some honorable exceptions, not generally. Like I've been told that AOC and Ilhan Omar have both made statements that are like statements of horror at what happened, as any normal human being would do. But some people are so blinded by ideology that, and the idea that you can't say that dancing in the streets at beheaded children is a bad thing, that you have to say, well, look, you need context, as though murder and rape and mutilation need context to understand them, is almost unfathomable. But we live in this world.
Yeah, well, I mean, just and the horror stories there go on. That chanting at the Sydney Opera House, gas the Jews, fuck the Jews.
Yes.
I mean, how is that any different than the Unite the Right? Jews will not replace us.
It's no different. It's like, as you said very astutely in your Substack, it's this shoehorn where the two sides come together. It's a loop.
The horseshoe, yeah.
The horseshoe.
Right. Yeah.
Shoehorn. I meant a horseshoe. Yeah. A shoehorn, a horseshoe. It's something. Yeah.
Yeah, but that does indicate, I mean, there's obviously been bubbling just beneath the surface, or maybe not always beneath the surface, of anti-Semitism is still around.
Yes.
In the Western world, in the United States.
Yeah, this is clearly anti-Semitic. I mean, you don't get this with any other country. First of all, let me just say, the fact that there are 50 Muslim countries in the world and 28, 29 Arab countries, and there is one Jewish country. And I never hear, I don't hear what the Turks are doing to the Kurds. I don't hear what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs. I don't hear what the Myanmar army is doing to the Rohingya. Nothing on campus. You could go through the day thinking that the single Jewish country is relentlessly pounded morally over and over and over again is not explicable by politics alone. It just isn't. There's a reason. There is a reason. And sadly, we know the reason.
Yeah. What is the deeper reason, just going back thousands of years, for anti-Semitism, in your thought, your opinion?
Okay, so I mean, this is an endlessly discussed topic, and I will say there's no reason why I have the answer, but I feel more confident giving answers about this than I do about politics. So here goes. I think the origin of anti-Semitism is the reality that people distrust the other. And the Jews were the identified other. That is, they weren't like us. The polytheists were, I'll take your God too, and I'll take his God, and I'll take the other guy's God. And then the Jews said, no, it doesn't work. We don't take your God. And then what was already a discomfort with the other became turbocharged, sadly, because the early Christians were Jews. And the worst fights are family fights. And family fights can be survived if they don't get put in a sacred book. But here you have a family fight that got solemnized and sanctified forever, so that suddenly it was all about you killed God. Hyman Maccabee, who was a British expert on anti-Semitism, pointed out something I think is really worth keeping in mind. He said, this is the only hatred where the one who is hated is thought of as both subhuman and superhuman. Jews are the vermin who control the world. He said, and the superhuman part comes because you can't kill a God unless you're superhumanly evil. So if the Jews killed Jesus, they're devils. They're not just bad people, they're devils. And once that element of magic and magic thinking enters into it, you know this from your work. I mean, your work about on conspiracies, it's a perfect complement to this. Once you start thinking magically, there is no end to this idea that, Jews create space lasers and
Right.
and I mean, it's so transparently idiotic that you don't think anyone could really believe it. Yeah. And then you have people live in the government who say this is true. And so I think that that's also a very big part of it. And the reason why anti-Semitism has not been as bad in the United States as it has been elsewhere is because the United States is one of the very, very, very few places in human history where Jews have not been the identified other, right? There were Frenchmen and Jews, there were Germans and Jews, there were Russians and Jews, but there aren't Americans and Jews. Rather, if there's an identified other in America, it's blacks, it's not Jews, right? And so Jews have done much better here because it's not like everybody says, oh, we're all the same, but those Jews are different. That was true in Poland. That was true in Ukraine, but it's not true here.
As a sidebar, do you accept Daniel Goldhagen's thesis of Hitler's willing executioners, that the anti-Semitism was so deep that it wasn't difficult to get people in these other countries to go along with the Holocaust?
So I accept the idea that anti-Semitism made it easier. But I've spent time in Rwanda, and I am unfortunately persuaded that you can make normal human beings, and I mean normal in every sense, doctors, lawyers, truck drivers, into brutal killing machines of someone that yesterday they had no ill will towards with astonishing ease.
Yeah,
it's scary if you go to a place like Rwanda, how quickly that happens, how brutally. I mean, people being slaughtered in the streets in front of their families, people who had lived next door, who you never really had a quarrel with, and so I accept that anti-Semitism made it somewhat easier, but I think that it's easier than we think to make that happen, and that the history of humanity, unfortunately, has too many examples that prove it true.
I think you're right. I mean, that was the point of Milgram's shock experiments. You take these undergraduates at Yale University, and then he went out into the community and just got truck drivers and lawyers and teachers and whatever, just regular people to go along with this under the right conditions. Yeah. It's almost like the metaphors get replayed over and over. Like there's a book, the vermin or the cockroaches with the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? They are bringing this disease to contaminate our group, and it seems to work.
I know this is a challenge to your friend of mine, Steven Pinker's thesis, that things are getting better. It's, I suppose, I mean, in terms of like data, in general data, they are getting better. But in terms of human nature,
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, yeah, it's dark in there.
it's not
um,
right.
yeah, yeah, but then there's also kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there, where if you exclude Jews from most professions, so they go into certain professions like finance, then you
Right.
go, oh look, they're taking over the finance, and they're plotting, they're conniving, it's a cabal, and so forth. And it's good to remember, even America, Jews were restricted from most universities, and that's why they created their own schools. And they go, oh
Right.
look, they're creating their own schools. It's a cabal.
Their own schools, their own country clubs, all of those sorts of things. I mean, anti-Semitism was, I would say, was more prevalent in America than we like to remember. Um, in part because we like to think of ourselves as exceptional, and also because we don't have a very good memory for bad things. We just don't. I mean, I suppose that that's a survival mechanism, and in that sense, it's a good one. But among other things, it scares me right now because I think in a week, when people look at what's going to happen in Gaza, they're not going to feel the full horror of what Hamas will do again if they're allowed to survive. And so it's an unsolvable dilemma.
Yeah. Groucho Marx used to joke this was in the 50s when his wife was not Jewish, so their daughter's half Jewish. And then he took her to the New York Country Club, which was restricted, and asked if she could go in up to her waist in the pool. One way to deal with anti-Semitism.
It really, when you think about it, it's just, it's crazy. And it's that anti-Semitism even exists in countries where there are no Jews.
Right.
Japan for a long time had no Jews. It had anti-Semitism, but it had no
Yeah.
Jews.
Yeah.
And you throw up your hands and say, what in the world do we have to do? But you find it all the time. I mean, I'm now, as I work with the ADL, as you know, and every time I have anything on Twitter that mentions the ADL, the number of like just, well, I don't know how many of them are bots and how many of them are people, but the number of responses that are just vile
Yeah.
are astonishing.
Oh, yeah, that the ADL is itself a terrorist organization, and
Yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing. Yeah, I've seen some of
So
that. Yeah, that's disturbing. Okay, let's talk though more about the serious efforts to achieve a two-state solution. What's the problem there? Why can't make this happen?
you're going to get a different answer from somebody who represents the Palestinian point of view, but I'll give you my answer. My answer is that, in fact, uh, in any place where ideology is still strong, they don't accept the legitimacy of the Jewish state. So why make a deal with it when they know sooner or later, probably for many of them with the help of God, it's going to disappear? When people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, the
Yeah,
river to the sea means all of Israel.
right.
They're not saying, two-state solution, let's join together and make peace. That's not the chant. So I think that the ideology, I used to hope that economics would overcome ideology. I wanted to be a Marxist when it came to the Middle East. But the ideology is very strong. I mean, look at what Hamas did. I want your listeners to think about this for a minute. When you ask yourself, okay, you're a Hamas fighter, you're going to fly into Israel. You know the chances are very good that you're going to die. But not only that, you know that the chances are 100% when this mission is over, that Israel is going to come into your neighborhood and destroy the homes you live in, the homes your parents live in, the homes your friends live in, the place where you go to school. I mean, you know this is going to happen. So what is the motivation? I can only think of two possibilities. One is that Hamas is a tool of Iran's, and they're basically being used to wreak destruction, but even then you have to wonder, why are they doing it willingly? Or the other is that the ideological hatred is so great that consequences are irrelevant to them. And that's really, really scary.
Yeah.
I mean, even the kamikazes, when they fought for Japan, they thought Japan was going to win.
Yeah. Or they just hold a sacred value that is more important than life itself.
But not only their life, everybody else's life too.
Right. Yeah. Right.
If it's my life, I understand there are certain things I would die for, but there are many things I would say, I'm willing to sacrifice all of America for that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, but in terms of like the two-state solution, this would be like asking, what would you sell your wife to me for? Like,
right.
What are you talking about? There's no price you could put on this is a sacred value.
I think many people feel exactly that way. I think that's true.
Yeah.
And they will not be satisfied until either there's a change of heart or Israel no longer exists.
Yeah. And it's almost like you got two guys standing on a piece of land, each of which has the deed to the land. And there's no title company you can go to say, settle this for us. Where was the line again here? Because they both claim, this is a sacred piece of land that was given to us by God, and there is no settling it.
Well, you must know this is a very old story. It's an old sort of joke about the scorpion and the horse, or the scorpion and the camel, and the scorpion says to the camel, take me across the desert, and the camel says, what are you, crazy? I'm going to put a scorpion on my back. You're going to sting me and kill me. And the scorpion says, why would I sting you? We'll both die. I won't be able to make it to the other side of the desert, and you'll die. So the camel says, it makes sense. And he takes him on his back, walks halfway, and the scorpion stings him. And he says, what are you doing? And there are two variations of this. One is the scorpion says, what can I do? I'm a scorpion. The other is, it's the Middle East. And that's what happens in the Middle East.
I've heard it slightly differently if it's a frog swimming across the pond or whatever. But I haven't heard the second one. It's the Middle East. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, I've never really understood that whole Christian thing, anti-Semitic thing about the Jews killed our Lord, Jesus. Well, first of all, your whole religion is based on the idea that Jesus died for your sins, so shouldn't you be thanking the Jews? In any case, it was the Romans, but shouldn't you be thanking them for?
I mean, I don't think hatreds follow a consistent
logical.
So, yeah. And I mean, first of all, Jesus is Jewish, of course.
Yes, right. Right.
But also, yes, if that had to happen, then it's hard to see why that was a bad thing. But I mean, it is possible to hold two opposite things in your mind at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, just here's a couple points as we wrap it up here from Jerry Cohen. I sent you his list. Since the 1930s, Palestinians have turned down 5 offers of a two-state solution, and most of those offers were good ones. That is, offers that would be acceptable by centrists on the issue. 2, Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, and now neither do Israel. He means this week. Most Palestinians want Israel eliminated. 3, a two-state solution won't eliminate Palestinian terrorism so long as many Palestinians want Israel wiped off the map. That's what you just said. Some of this I didn't know. The 1988 Charter of Hamas, the rulers of Gaza, explicitly calls, you did mention that, calls for the elimination of Israel. And so on. Yeah, it just seems, we're used to negotiating with people. There's no negotiating with terrorists. Are there just some people that are evil, like they belong to a death cult, and we should keep that separate from, say, political Palestinian politicians or whatever?
So what I want, the way I want to phrase it is, I think very, very, very few people are actually born evil. There are those. I don't doubt that. I think that normal people can be made evil by terrible beliefs and even terrible associations. I really do. We all know people who make bad friends and end up doing really bad things because of those bad friends, and conversely, who fall in with a better crowd. It's like I used to make fun of my parents like everybody else did because they were so concerned about who my friends were, but they were right. It makes a difference. So I think that it's not that people in Hamas were born evil, but I think they have for various reasons, subscribed to an ideology that makes them do evil things. And I don't know how you describe someone as evil except that they do evil things. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Solzhenitsyn's,
right.
a quote about the evil, cuts through the heart of every human being.
That's right.
And I think that's right. I think, maybe there's maybe 1 to 3% psychopaths is the number you usually see. But a lot of those work on Wall Street or they're corporate CEOs or whatever. They're just cutthroat lawyers and whatnot. So maybe just a fraction of those are serial killers. They're, Machiavellian, narcissistic, and violent tendencies. That's not the problem we're talking about here at all. We're talking about ideology of people like those students saying, gas the Jews. How could anybody say this? Looking at these beheaded babies, those pictures are going around now publicly.
It's because you don't see them as human beings.
Right.
The ability to dehumanize humans is unfortunately part of our mental equipment. And if you allow that to happen, I remember once giving a sermon to my congregation about how you're not allowed to say but. You can't say it's tragic that 4 Palestinian children were killed on a beach by an Israeli bomber, but because then you invalidate everything that comes before. You just have to say this is tragic, and it's sometimes hard for people to do that because they live in tribe B and they don't want to give anything to tribe A. But when we do that, we make ourselves into something less than human.
We're recording this on the 12th. Supposedly there's some rumors going around about tomorrow, Friday the 13th, so we'll release this Friday morning, of a concerted effort to kill Jews around the world. Have you heard this? Is this a credible?
I've heard it. It's not, by the way, it is not the first time that I've heard such things. So I am hopeful that, like in previous times, it's a meme, but it's not real. The fact, I say this sometimes to Christian and Muslims whom I know. I say, look, you don't have a guard in front of your mosque. You don't have a guard in front of your church. But I don't know of any synagogue that doesn't either have guards or want guards. Now, why is that? It's because Jews are not out marauding trying to kill Muslims and Christians. And unfortunately, there are people who are out and want to kill Jews, and that's been the tragedy of Jewish history.
Yeah, I remember coming to your synagogue for the first time in LA, and all the security measures and gates, and it's like, whoa. And because I've seen that in Germany. My wife's from Germany, so I've seen this in every synagogue there. But in LA, liberal Los Angeles,
I know. And the most security I ever saw in my synagogue, more than Tony Blair, more than the Dalai Lama, was Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Right.
And her enemies are exactly the same enemies that we're talking about, the same ones. I remember we had dinner at a restaurant. They swept the restaurant before we would sit down for dinner. And I just thought, this is insane, this poor woman.
I know her pretty well. And yeah, she always has security around her. She came to speak at Occidental College in LA, so I went to see her. And there was the usual protesters against her, and some woman in the Q&A accused her of being, Islamophobia and the whole thing. And she basically said, then why is it I have to travel with these armed guards standing here?
Yeah, exactly. Right. I'm not threatening anyone.
It's astonishing. Yeah. All right, David, are you hopeful for the coming weeks and months? Are you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll tell you. So this is a personality quirk.
Okay. Yes. Give it to me.
I'm hopeful by nature. I really am.
Yeah.
My daughter says to me every now and then, she'll say something along the lines of, Dad, it's really irritating that you think things are always going to work out, but I'm really glad deep down that you always think things are going to work out. So I'm not naive, and I don't want to say that this is not going to be an extremely difficult several weeks to come. But yeah, I am ultimately hopeful because unlike being an optimist, hopeful means that we have it in our power to create something better. And I think we do. And let's hope that comes to pass.
I share that. I share that optimism. I mean, Israel is a democratic nation, and it's governed by the principles of, well, even when Netanyahu declared war, where there's rules about engagement in war,
Yeah.
and it's so.
Yeah.
We'll see. All right. Well, we'll revisit this maybe in a few weeks or months to see
All right.
how it's
Great to talk to
become.
you.
Thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time.
you.